Gate 47, Heathrow Terminal 5. The boarding announcement echoed through the terminal as I stood there, frozen, watching him disappear down the jet bridge without so much as a backward glance. No boarding pass in my hand. No seat reserved. No explanation. Just me, Victoria Ashford, standing there like a fool while the man I'd trusted with my heart, my home and my fortune walked away with a smile on his face. And my future in his pocket. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Damien Rothwell had always been smooth, charming, the kind of man who could convince you that black was white, and have you thanking him for the revelation. But standing there in that sterile airport corridor, watching the gate agent pull back the rope and seal off the entrance to Flight BA 445 to the Seychelles, I finally saw him for what he truly was. A predator. A calculated, methodical predator who had just executed the final phase of what I now realized was a 2-year plan to destroy me. The destination was supposed to be our engagement celebration. The Seychelles. 4 Seasons Resort. Presidential suite. I'd booked it all, of course. Paid for it all. Just like I'd paid for everything else in our relationship. His designer suits, his luxury car lease, his mother's medical bills, his sister's wedding, his failed business venture. 2 years of financing a lifestyle I thought we were building together, when really I was just funding his exit strategy. The boarding pass that should have been in my hand was somewhere in his carry-on bag. The seat I'd paid for was occupied by someone else, probably his assistant, Natalie, who'd been working late an awful lot lately. The ring he was supposed to give me was likely being sized for someone else's finger, and the prenuptial agreement he'd been pressuring me to sign, the one that would give him half of everything I'd worked 20 years to build, was probably already notarized and filed away, waiting for the perfect moment to surface. But here's what Damien didn't know about Victoria Ashford. Here's what 2 years of his manipulation, his gaslighting, his subtle financial abuse had failed to uncover. I didn't build a multi-million-dollar consulting firm by being naive. I didn't survive a hostile takeover attempt in my 20s by being trusted. And I sure as hell didn't become one of London's most successful businesswomen by letting men like him walk all over me. The moment that gate closed, something shifted inside me. Not heartbreak, that had been building for months, as I watched him slowly reveal his true nature. Not anger. That was too hot, too immediate, too easily dismissed. No, what I felt was something far more dangerous. Clarity. Cold, calculating, laser-focused clarity. While other passengers around me were complaining about delays and checking their phones for restaurant recommendations, I was pulling out mine for an entirely different purpose. The contact list that had taken me 2 decades to build. The network of influence that Damien had always been impressed by but never truly understood. The relationships that had survived market crashes, business partnerships, and personal betrayals, because they were built on mutual respect and genuine value exchange. My first call was to Harrison Webb, my private investigator, the same man who'd helped me uncover the corporate espionage that almost destroyed my company 5 years ago. Harrison, it's Victoria. I need everything you can find on Damien Roth: financial records, communication logs, travel history, associates, family connections, everything, and I need it yesterday. My second call was to my attorney, Patricia Sinclair, the woman who'd represented me through 3 major acquisitions and countless contract negotiations. Patricia, I need you to freeze all joint accounts immediately. Yes, all of them. And I need you to review every document Damien has had access to in the past 6 months. Consider this a code red situation. My third call was to Blackstone Aviation, the private jet company I'd used for business travel for over a decade. James, this is Victoria Ashford. I need a Gulfstream G650 fueled and ready for departure to Mahé, Seychelles within the hour. Money is no object. I don't care if you have to bump another client. But the fourth call was the most important one. The call that would set in motion a chain of events that would make Damien's little airport abandonment look like a child's prank in comparison. Theodore Blackmont, came the crisp voice on the other end. Theodore owned half the luxury resorts in the Indian Ocean. including several in the Seychelles. We'd done business together for years, and more importantly, we'd developed the kind of professional relationship built on mutual respect and shared values. Theodore, it's Victoria. I need a favor, a big one, and I need it to be absolutely bulletproof. As I walked through Heathrow toward the private aviation terminal, my heels clicking against the polished floor with the rhythm of a funeral march, I couldn't help but smile. Damien thought he was clever. He thought he'd left me stranded, humiliated, and broken. He thought he'd won. What he'd actually done was given me the greatest gift of all. He'd shown me exactly who he was, and exactly what he was capable of. And in doing so, he'd freed me to show him exactly who Victoria Ashford was when she stopped playing nice. The Seychelles was about to become very interesting, and Damien Rothwell was about to learn that, when you try to destroy someone who's spent 2 decades building an empire, you better make sure you succeed on the first try, because there wouldn't be a second chance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 2 years earlier, I first met Damien Rothwell at the Meridian Club in Mayfair. It was one of those exclusive networking events, where London's elite gathered to discuss everything from market trends to charity galas. I remember the exact moment our eyes met across the mahogany-paneled bar. He was standing near the fireplace, effortlessly commanding a small circle of admirers with what appeared to be a fascinating story about his latest venture in sustainable technology. At 38, I'd built Ashford Consulting from the ground up, transforming it from a one-woman operation in my cramped Shoreditch flat into a powerhouse firm with offices in 3 countries. I'd worked 18-hour days, sacrificed countless weekends, and poured every ounce of my energy into creating something that mattered. Success had brought me financial security, professional respect, and a beautiful townhouse in Belgravia, but it had also brought isolation. The higher I climbed, the lonelier the view became. Damien appeared to be everything I'd been missing: sophisticated without being pretentious, ambitious without being ruthless, charming without being shallow. He approached me that evening with genuine curiosity about my work, asking intelligent questions about market disruption and global expansion strategies. Unlike most men I encountered in business circles, he didn't seem intimidated by my success or determined to diminish. "Victoria Ashford," he said, extending a perfectly manicured hand, "I've heard remarkable things about your work with the Pemberton merger. Brilliant strategy." He knew my work. He'd done his research. He spoke my language fluently, the language of business, ambition, and strategic thinking. For a woman who'd spent years feeling like she had to choose between professional success and personal connection, Damien seemed to offer the impossible: a partner who could match my intellectual energy while appreciating my achievement. Our first date was at Sketch in Mayfair, where he insisted on paying despite my protest. "Let me be old-fashioned just this once," he said with that devastating smile. "You can buy dinner next time." There was something refreshing about a man who could acknowledge my independence while still wanting to take care of me occasionally. He told me about his background: Oxford educated, family money from shipping, currently developing eco-friendly technologies for the hospitality industry. His passion for environmental sustainability aligned perfectly with my own values, and his family connections in various industries seemed to complement my consulting expertise beautifully. Within 3 months, we were practically inseparable. Damien had a way of fitting seamlessly into my life without overwhelming it. He'd bring me coffee during late-night work sessions, attend industry events as my charming companion, and offer thoughtful insights on my business challenge. He never made me feel guilty for working late or traveling for clients. Instead, he celebrated my successes as if they were his own. "You're extraordinary, Victoria," he'd whisper during quiet moments in my Belgravia garden. "Watching you navigate these deals, seeing you command those boardrooms, it's like watching an artist create a masterpiece." He moved into my townhouse gradually, organically. First it was leaving a few clothes in my spare wardrobe, then keeping toiletries in my bathroom. Before I knew it, he'd transformed the guest room into a home office where he could work on his various projects while I traveled for business. It felt natural, comfortable, like we were building something real together. Damien had exquisite taste that matched my own. He'd surprise me with fresh orchids for my office, recommend wines that perfectly complemented our dinner parties, and suggest thoughtful improvements to my home's decor. His aesthetic sensibilities elevated everything around him, including me. Friends commented on how radiant I looked, how relaxed I seemed, how well we complemented each other. He integrated beautifully into my social circle, charming my business associates at dinner parties, and remembering personal details about their families and interests. My closest friend Helena Morrison pulled me aside after one particularly successful gathering and said, "Victoria, darling, he's perfect for you. I've never seen you this happy." Looking back now, I realize that was exactly the point. Damien Rothwell was a master craftsman, and I was his most important project. Every gesture, every word, every seemingly spontaneous moment of affection was carefully calculated to make me feel like I'd finally found my missing piece. The foundation he built was so solid, so convincing, so perfectly tailored to my specific needs and vulnerabilities that when the cracks began to show, I'd be willing to do anything to preserve what we'd created, including ignore my own instincts when they started screaming warnings I wasn't ready to hear. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, just as London was beginning to shake off winter's grip. I was reviewing quarterly projections in my office when Damien burst through the door, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, his face pale with panic. In all the months I'd known him, I'd never seen him anything less than perfectly composed. "Victoria, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Something terrible has happened." I immediately cleared my schedule, sending my assistant Rebecca away, and closing the office door. Damien collapsed into the leather chair across from my desk, burying his face in his hands. For several long moments, he said nothing, just sat there trembling slightly, and I felt my heart breaking for whatever was causing him such obvious anguish. "The Rothwell Group is finished," he finally whispered, looking up at me with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the span of minutes. "Everything my family built over 3 generations. It's all gone." The story unfolded like a nightmare. According to Damien, his business partner and childhood friend, Jonathan Blackthorne, had been embezzling funds for months. Systematic theft that had gone undetected, until a routine audit revealed massive discrepancies in their accounts. The sustainable technology project they'd been developing, the one Damien spoke about so passionately, had been nothing more than a front for Jonathan's elaborate fraud scheme. "The investors are pulling out," Damien continued, his voice hollow. "They're threatening lawsuits. My family's reputation is destroyed. Jonathan disappeared 2 days ago with what was left in our operational accounts. The authorities have frozen everything while they investigate." I watched this strong, confident man crumble before my eyes, and every protective instinct I possessed screamed at me to help him. This was the man who'd brought joy back into my meticulously organized life, who'd shown me that success meant nothing without someone to share it with. "How much do you need?" I asked quietly. He looked up sharply, as if my offer had surprised him. "Victoria, no, I can't ask you to. You're not asking, I'm offering." "How much?" The figure he named was staggering. £800,000 to cover immediate debts and legal fees, another $1 million to restart the business properly, with better security measures and thorough vetting of all partners. It represented nearly 40% of my liquid assets, accumulated over 15 years of careful investment and business growth. "I'll pay it back, every penny," he promised, gripping my hands across the desk. "With interest. Once we rebuild, once we clear the family name, I'll make sure you're the first priority. You're saving not just my business, Victoria, you're saving my entire legacy." I didn't hesitate. That afternoon, I instructed my financial advisor, Richard Pembroke, to liquidate several investment accounts and transfer the funds to a new account I established specifically for Damien's business recovery. Richard expressed concerns about the size of the transfer, suggesting due diligence and legal documentation, but I dismissed his worries. "This wasn't a business transaction. This was love. Mr. Pembroke, I appreciate your caution, but this is my decision." Damien is family now, and family doesn't require contracts and collateral. Over the following weeks, I watched Damien throw himself into rebuilding his company with admirable determination. He worked 18-hour days, networked relentlessly, and slowly began to show signs of his former confidence returning. The crisis had brought us closer together, Shared adversity had a way of cementing relationships in ways that good times never could. I covered his personal expenses during this period as well, the lease on his Porsche, his membership fees at various clubs, his mother's private medical care. These seemed like small prices to pay to remove additional stress from his shoulders while he focused on the monumental task of business recovery. "You're an angel, Victoria," he told me one evening as we sat in my garden, sharing a bottle of wine after another long day. "I don't know what I did to deserve someone like you in my life. Most women would have run at the first sign of financial trouble." I remember feeling so proud in that moment, so validated in my choice to stand by him. Here was proof that I'd chosen wisely, that Damien was different from the opportunistic men who'd tried to use my success for their own gain in the past. A lesser man would have been emasculated by accepting help from his girlfriend. Damien was secure enough to accept assistance while maintaining his dignity and working tirelessly to recover. The insurance settlement from the Rothwell Group's dissolution came through faster than expected. Apparently Jonathan Blackthorne's theft had been so blatant that the investigation concluded quickly. Damien received a substantial payout that more than covered what I'd loaned him, along with the promised interest. Instead of repaying me immediately, however, he proposed something more ambitious. "Victoria, what if we combined our resources? Your business acumen, my industry connections, your capital, my vision. We could build something unprecedented together, a consulting and development hybrid that could dominate the sustainable technology market." The proposal was intoxicating. Partnership in business and in life, building an empire together that neither of us could create alone. I agreed to reinvest my repayment into our joint venture, Ashford Rothwell Enterprises. We spent weeks developing business plans, identifying target markets, and dreaming about our shared future. Looking back now, I understand that this crisis was the masterpiece of Damien's manipulation. Every tier had been calculated, every moment of vulnerability carefully choreographed. He'd studied me for months, identified my deepest need to be needed, my desire to be the strong partner in a relationship rather than the protected one. He'd given me exactly what I'd never known I wanted, the chance to be someone's hero. For 3 blissful months after the crisis, everything felt perfect again, better than perfect, actually. Damien had transformed into the most attentive, grateful partner I could have imagined. He surprised me with handwritten notes tucked into my briefcase before business trips, expressing his gratitude and admiration for my strength during his darkest hour. Fresh flowers appeared in my office every Monday without fail, always accompanied by cards that made my heart flutter like a schoolgirl's. "To the woman who saved my world," read one particularly memorable note, "every success from here forward belongs to both of." He insisted on cooking elaborate dinners when I returned from late client meetings, creating these intimate evenings where we'd discuss our joint business plans over wine and candlelight. Ashford Rothwell Enterprises was taking shape beautifully, with Damien handling the creative development side while I managed operations and client relationships. We complemented each other perfectly, or so it seemed. The gratitude extended beyond romantic gesture. Damien made a point of publicly crediting me whenever business associates asked about his recovery. At networking events, he'd introduce me not just as his girlfriend, but as his business savior and intellectual equal. Victoria didn't just believe in me, he'd tell potential investors. She invested in a vision when everyone else saw only failure. His family embraced me with warmth that felt genuine and overwhelming. His mother, Eleanor Rothwell, invited me to their estate in Gloucestershire for Sunday lunches, where she'd share stories about the family business legacy and express her profound gratitude for my support during their time of crisis. His sister Caroline began including me in her inner circle of friends, treating me like the sister she'd never had. "You're the best thing that ever happened to Damien," Eleanor told me one afternoon, as we walked through her rose garden. "I was so worried about him after the business collapsed, but you brought back his confidence, you brought back his smile." Even his extended network seemed to revolve around acknowledging my role in his resurrection. Business partners who'd previously dismissed him began showing serious interest in our joint ventures, citing my involvement as a key factor in their confidence. My reputation, built over years of successful consulting work, was lending credibility to his projects in ways that accelerated our progress exponentially. The physical intimacy between us reached new heights during this period as well. Damien had always been an attentive lover, But now there was an added dimension of worship in the way he touched me, as if my body was something sacred that deserved reverence. He'd trace patterns on my skin while whispering about our future together, about the empire we'd build, about the family we'd create once the business was fully established. "You're not just my partner, Victoria," he'd murmur against my neck. "You're my destiny. Everything I've been through, all the failures and setbacks, they were just preparing me for you." Our social calendar became a carefully orchestrated celebration of our partnership. Damien arranged dinner parties where he'd showcase both my business acumen and our relationship dynamic, creating an environment where I felt simultaneously respected professionally and cherished personally. Guests would leave these evenings commenting on how perfectly matched we were, how obvious it was that we'd found something rare and special. He began incorporating me into every aspect of his life with enthusiastic deliberation. My opinions on his clothing choices, my preferences for vacation destinations, my thoughts on potential business partnerships. Everything seemed to matter to him in ways that made me feel valued beyond my financial contribution. When I suggested we needed better legal documentation for our joint venture, he agreed immediately and enthusiastically. "Of course, darling. Your experience with corporate structures is exactly what this partnership needs. I trust your judgment completely." The legal meetings with our attorney, Michael Hardington, became collaborative sessions where Damien deferred to my expertise while contributing creative insights that enhanced our strategic planning. We developed operating agreements that seemed to protect both our interests while maximizing our combined potential. I felt like we were building something that could outlast both of us individually. Damien started talking about marriage during this period, but in the most organic, pressure-free way imaginable. He'd mention ring shopping while we walked past jewelry stores, or comment on beautiful wedding venues when we traveled for business, always framing these observations as distant future possibilities rather than immediate expectations. "Someday, when we're ready," he'd say, squeezing my hand as we passed a particularly stunning chapel in the Cotswolds. "When the business is established and we can focus on celebrating rather than building." The patience he showed regarding our timeline felt mature and considerate. Unlike other men I'd dated who'd either rushed toward commitment or avoided it entirely, Damien seemed content to let our relationship evolve naturally, while we focused on our professional goals together. He started suggesting we upgrade our living situation as well, pointing out properties that could accommodate both our personal needs and our business operations. Not pushing, just planting seeds about our expanded future, while making it clear that any decisions would be entirely collaborative. "The penthouse in Canary Wharf has incredible office space," he mentioned casually during one of our Sunday morning coffee rituals. "Imagine the client meetings we could host there, the impression we'd make. But of course, only if you think it makes sense for our growth trajectory." Everything felt intentional yet effortless, strategic yet spontaneous. I'd never experienced a relationship where my professional success enhanced rather than threatened the dynamic, where my financial independence was celebrated rather than resented. Damien had created an environment where I felt simultaneously powerful and protected, successful and supported. Looking back, I realized this period was the most dangerous phase of his manipulation. He'd identified exactly what I needed to feel completely secure in our relationship: gratitude, partnership, and patience, and he'd delivered all of it with such apparent authenticity that I began to believe I'd finally found someone who could match my strength rather than be intimidated by it. The trap was perfectly constructed, and I walked into it willingly, gratefully, with my eyes wide open and my guard completely down. The first crack appeared on a Thursday evening in late September. I'd returned early from a client meeting in Edinburgh, my flight landing 2 hours ahead of schedule due to favorable winds. Excited to surprise Damien with an impromptu dinner, I quietly let myself into the townhouse, planning to cook his favorite dish and open that bottle of Chateau Margaux we'd been saving for a special occasion. The house felt different the moment I stepped in. There was an energy, a tension that hadn't been there when I'd left that morning. I could hear Damien's voice coming from his office, engaged in what sounded like an intense phone conversation. Nothing unusual about that. Our business required constant communication with investors and partners, but something in his tone made me pause at the bottom of the stairs. "No, she doesn't suspect anything," I heard him say, his voice carrying a coldness I'd never heard before. "Victoria's too trusting, too invested in the fairy tale to see what's really happening." My blood turned to ice. I stood frozen in my own hallway, shopping bags from Harrods still clutched in my hands, trying to process what I'd just heard. Surely he was talking about someone else, some business associate or client, but then he continued. The prenup's almost ready. Once we're married, I'll have legal access to everything. Her consulting firm, the properties, all those investment accounts she thinks are so cleverly diversified. Hardington says the documentation is bulletproof. The shopping bags slipped from my numb fingers, but the sound was muffled by the Persian rug. I crept closer to his office door, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain he'd hear it. Caroline's playing her part perfectly, Damien continued with what sounded like amusement. Victoria absolutely adores feeling like part of the family. Mother's Sunday lunches, the rose garden walks, all those touching moments about family legacy, it's almost too easy. She's so desperate to belong somewhere that she can't see the performance. My legs nearly gave out. Caroline, sweet Caroline who'd welcomed me into her friend group, who'd asked me to be her maid of honor when she got engaged. Eleanor, who'd shared family photographs and talked about the Rothwell traditions she wanted me to help carry forward. All of it calculated, all of it fake. The business partnership was genius, I'll give you that, he said to whoever was on the other end. She's so proud of Ashford Rothwell Enterprises, so excited about our shared vision. She has no idea that every contract we've signed puts her assets at risk if the business fails. And businesses fail all the time, don't they? I had to grip the doorframe to keep from collapsing. The joint venture I'd been so proud of, the legal documents I'd helped draft, the combined assets I'd thought would protect both our interests. It was all a trap, a sophisticated, long-term trap that I'd helped build around myself. Natalie's been invaluable through all of this, Damien continued, and I felt another piece of my world crumble. Natalie, his assistant, who'd always been so professional, so respectful during our business meetings. She's kept track of every financial transfer, every account detail. Victoria's so focused on the big picture that she never pays attention to the administrative details. Classic executive blindness. The conversation continued, but I could barely process the word. Something about timeline acceleration, about moving up plans, about how my recent trip to Edinburgh had provided the perfect opportunity to finalize certain arrangements. I realized with growing horror that he'd probably planned for me to be away, had orchestrated that client meeting to give himself time to coordinate with his accomplices. When I heard him wrapping up the call, I forced myself to move, creeping back toward the front door with my heart pounding. I managed to slip outside just as I heard his office door opening, and I stood on my own doorstep for several minutes, trying to figure out how to process what I'd just learned. By the time I re-entered the house, making sure to announce my arrival normally, I'd managed to compose my expression into something resembling normalcy. Damien appeared at the top of the stairs, all smiles and warmth, exactly the loving partner he'd been that morning when he'd kissed me goodbye. "Darling, you're back early," he said, bounding down the stairs to embrace me. How did the Edinburgh meeting go? The ease with which he shifted between his true self and this performance was terrifying. Looking into his eyes, searching for any trace of the cold calculation I'd heard in his voice moments before, I found nothing but apparent genuine affection and interest. "It went well," I managed, allowing him to kiss me while my skin crawled. "The contract terms are exactly what we discussed." "Brilliant." I knew Davidson would come around once he understood the value proposition. He took my coat, hung it carefully in the closet, and suggested we open a bottle of wine to celebrate. I've been looking forward to hearing all about it. As he moved around the kitchen, preparing our drinks and asking detailed questions about the client meeting, I studied him with new eyes. Every gesture I'd found charming now seemed calculated. Every question about my business dealings now sounded like intelligence gathering. Every expression of love and gratitude now felt like manipulation designed to keep me compliant and unsuspecting. The worst part was how good he was at it. Even knowing what I now knew, I could almost convince myself I'd misheard the phone conversation. The man pouring wine and asking about my day seemed so genuinely caring, so perfectly attuned to my needs and moods, that my rational mind struggled to reconcile this version with the cold strategist I'd overheard. "You seem tired, love," he said, reaching across to touch my cheek with apparent concern. "Why don't I run you a bath while I finish dinner? You've been working so hard lately." The tenderness in his voice, the worried expression, the gentle touch. If I hadn't heard that phone conversation, I would have melted at his thoughtfulness. Instead, I felt sick knowing that this caring boyfriend was a complete fabrication, a role he played with Oscar-worthy skill. "That sounds perfect," I replied, forcing a smile while mentally noting that he wanted me out of the way again, probably to make more calls or coordinate more plans. As I sat in the bath he'd drawn, surrounded by the expensive oils he'd thoughtfully added, I began to understand the true scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't a simple gold digger situation or even a straightforward. This was a sophisticated, long-term operation involving multiple people, careful legal maneuvering, and psychological manipulation, so subtle that I'd actually helped design my own destruction. But Damien had made one crucial error. He'd underestimated the very thing that had made me successful in business, my ability to think strategically under pressure and my unwillingness to be anyone's victim. The following weeks became an exercise in careful observation and mounting dread. Once I knew what to look for, the patterns became impossible to ignore. What I'd previously dismissed as minor inconsistencies now formed a clear picture of systematic deception that made my stomach turn with each new discovery. Damien's business calls, which I'd always respected by giving him privacy, began to sound different when I caught fragments through closed doors, references to the timeline and Phase 2 that didn't align with any of our joint business plans, mentions of people whose names I didn't recognize, but who seemed intimately familiar with our personal arrangements. Hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I entered a room. His laptop, which he'd previously left open and unlocked around the house, suddenly required password. His phone, once casually left on kitchen counters and bedside tables, now never left his person. When I asked about the increased security measures, he laughed it off as necessary precautions for our expanding business interest. "Can't be too careful with intellectual property these days," he said, sliding his phone into his jacket pocket after what appeared to be a routine text conversation. "Industrial espionage is a real threat in our sector," but I'd seen enough of that text exchange to notice it wasn't about business. The visible portion included references to keeping her calm until Paris, and something about after the proposal. My blood ran cold as I realized he was talking about me, about plans I wasn't privy to, about managing my emotional state like I was a problem to be solved rather than a partner to be consulted. The Paris reference was particularly chilling because we'd just booked a romantic getaway to the City of Light for the following month. What I'd thought was Damien's spontaneous desire to celebrate our relationship's success now seemed like another calculated move in whatever game he was playing. Natalie's behavior around me shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Previously warm and professional, she now seemed nervous in my presence, avoiding direct eye contact and cutting conversations short whenever I appeared in our shared office space. I caught her quickly closing documents on her computer screen when I walked by, documents that looked like financial spreadsheets rather than the sustainability reports she claimed to be working on. During one particularly awkward encounter, I noticed she'd received a text message that made her face pale. When I asked if everything was all right, she stammered something about family troubles and excused herself from the meeting we'd been conducting with potential investors. Later, when I asked Damien about Natalie's family situation, he seemed genuinely confused about what I was referring to. Family troubles. Natalie's parents are both perfectly healthy, as far as I know. Perhaps she was dealing with some personal matter she preferred to keep private. The disconnect between her obvious distress and his apparent ignorance suggested they were communicating about things he wasn't sharing with me. Things important enough to upset his typically composed assistant, but not significant enough for him to be aware of them, unless of course he was lying. Caroline's invitations, once frequent and seemingly spontaneous, began to feel orchestrated. Every lunch, every shopping trip, every cultural event she included me in, now seemed designed to extract information about my business dealings, my family relationships, my financial arrangements. Questions I'd previously interpreted as friendly interest now sounded like intelligence gathering. "How wonderful that your consulting firm is so diversified," she'd comment over afternoon tea at Claridge's. "Damien mentioned you have interests in several different markets. That must provide such security, knowing you're not dependent on any single revenue stream." When I'd share details about recent acquisitions or investment strategies, She'd listen with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to casual conversation. She'd ask follow-up questions that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of financial structures that didn't align with her background in art history and charity work. Eleanor's Sunday lunches, once highlight of my social calendar, began to feel like performance art designed for my benefit. The family stories she shared about Rothwell business traditions now seemed carefully curated to reinforce themes of legacy, inheritance, and family loyalty. Her expressions of gratitude for my support during their crisis period felt rehearsed, as if she'd practiced the exact words and gestures that would most effectively manipulate my emotions. "You're already so much part of this family, dear," she'd say, squeezing my hand across the dining table. "Damien's father would have loved you. He always said the right woman could elevate a man beyond what he could achieve alone." These statements, which had once filled me with warmth and belonging, now made me wonder what role I was actually playing in their family drama. Was I the loving daughter-in-law to be, or was I the wealthy outsider being groomed for systematic exploitation? The business meetings that had once energized me with their collaborative spirit began to feel like elaborate theater production. Potential investors would ask pointed questions about my personal involvement in the venture, my long-term commitment to the partnership, my willingness to expand our shared asset. These inquiries, positioned as due diligence, now seemed designed to establish my financial vulnerability, rather than assess our business viability. Michael Hardington, our attorney, scheduled increasingly frequent consultations about legal documentation that seemed unnecessarily complex for a straightforward business partnership. Contracts that required my signature on multiple pages containing dense legal language that, when I tried to review carefully, were dismissed as standard boilerplate language that didn't require detailed examination. "These are just protective measures for both parties," Hardington would assure me when I expressed concern about specific clauses. "The complexity is necessary given the scope of your combined assets and the international nature of your planned operation." But late-night Google searches about the legal terminology revealed provisions that could potentially expose me to significant liability if the business encountered difficulties. Clauses that seemed designed to protect Damien's interests while putting mine at risk. Language that suggested I'd be responsible for debts and obligations I hadn't explicitly agreed to undertake. The most disturbing pattern was how seamlessly all these elements worked together. Caroline would extract information about my assets during our social time, which would then appear in business discussions with potential investors. Eleanor would reinforce themes about family commitment and shared legacy that aligned perfectly with the legal documents Hardington was preparing. Natalie would have access to financial details that informed Damien's conversations with people I'd never met. Every person in Damien's orbit seemed to be playing a specific role in what was beginning to look like an elaborate, long-term con designed to separate me from everything I'd worked decades to build. The sophistication of the operation was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications, but the most chilling realization was how perfectly they'd assessed my psychological vulnerability. My desire to belong to a family, my pride in being the strong partner in a relationship, my professional confidence that made me dismiss concerns about personal matters. They'd identified every weakness and crafted a strategy that exploited them systematically. What scared me most was how close they'd come to succeeding. If I hadn't returned early from Edinburgh that day, if I hadn't overheard that phone conversation, I might have walked blindly into whatever trap they were constructing, until it was too late to escape. The devastating truth revealed itself on a Saturday morning in late October, during what should have been one of the happiest moments of our relationship. Damien had woken up early to prepare breakfast in bed, something he'd done countless times before, but that morning felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of anticipation that I mistook for romantic excitement. "I have something special planned for today," he said, setting down a tray of perfectly prepared eggs, Benedict, and fresh orange juice. "Something I've been working on for weeks." My heart fluttered with the possibility that this might be the proposal we'd been discussing in abstract terms. The timing felt right. Our business was thriving. Our relationship had weathered the crisis of his financial troubles, and we'd been talking more seriously about our future together. I'd even caught myself looking at wedding venues online, though I'd never admitted that to him. After breakfast, he suggested we spend the day at his family's estate in Gloucestershire. Eleanor had mentioned wanting to show me the family archives, the historical documents and photographs that traced the Rothwell legacy back several generations. It seemed like the perfect setting for a romantic proposal, surrounded by the family history I'd become so invested in preserving. The drive to the estate was filled with Damien's usual charm and conversation, but I noticed he seemed nervous in a way I'd never seen before. His hands drummed against the steering wheel at traffic lights, and he kept checking his phone despite usually maintaining strict driving etiquette about mobile devices. "Everything all right?" I asked as we turned into the estate's long gravel driveway. "Perfect," he said, but his smile seemed forced, just excited about today. "It's going to be memorable." Eleanor greeted us at the front door with unusual formality, dressed in what looked like her finest day wear, despite this being a casual family visit. Caroline was already there, along with several people I didn't recognize, well-dressed individuals who seemed out of place for a relaxed Saturday afternoon. "Victoria, darling, come in," Eleanor said, but her warmth felt different, more theatrical than usual. "We have so much to show you today." They led me to the library, a magnificent room lined with leather-bound volumes and family portraits that I'd always found intimidating and impressive in equal measure. The strangers had arranged themselves around the room like an audience, and I began to feel unsettled by the staged quality of the gathering. "Before we begin," Damien said, taking my hand with what I thought was romantic nervousness, "I want you to know how much you mean to me, to all of us. Your support, your love, your incredible generosity, it's changed everything." My heart was racing with anticipation when Caroline stepped forward holding what looked like a legal document. Not the small jewelry box I'd been hoping for, but an official-looking folder that immediately triggered my business instincts. "Victoria," Caroline said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "we'd like you to sign a formal acknowledgement of your commitment to the family, to the legacy we're all building together." The document was a prenuptial agreement, but not the straightforward asset protection agreement I'd expected to discuss before any engagement. This was a comprehensive document that outlined terms so favorable to Damien that it essentially guaranteed him access to my entire estate, my business, and my future earnings regardless of the circumstances of any potential divorce. "This seems quite extensive," I said, trying to maintain composure while my mind raced through the implications of what I was reading. "Perhaps I should have my own attorney review this before signing anything." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Damien's expression shifted from nervous excitement to something harder, more calculating. Eleanor's theatrical warmth disappeared entirely, replaced by cold expectation. The strangers, who I now realized were probably witnesses or legal representatives, watched me with professional detachment. "Victoria," Damien said, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, "this is just a formality, a way to protect both our interests as we move forward together. Surely you trust me enough to sign something that simply formalizes what we've already been building." But I kept reading, and with each clause the scope of the deception became clearer. This wasn't just a prenup, it was a comprehensive legal framework that would give Damien control over assets I'd never agreed to share. Business interests, property holdings, investment accounts, even intellectual property related to my consulting work. "There are provisions here that would give you controlling interest in Ashford Consulting," I said, looking up from the document. "That was never part of our discussions about shared assets." "Technicalities," Caroline interjected smoothly. "Legal language required to protect the business structure we've created together. You've been so involved in Ashford Rothwell Enterprises that the boundaries between your individual and shared assets needed clarification." The room felt like it was closing in on me as I realized this entire weekend had been orchestrated as a pressure situation designed to force my signature on a document that would essentially transfer my life's work to someone who'd been systematically deceiving me for months. "I need time to review this properly," I said, standing up and folding the document. "This is too important to rush through, regardless of how much I trust everyone in this room." Eleanor's mask slipped completely. "Victoria, dear, surely you're not going to let legal paranoia undermine everything we've built together. This family has welcomed you with open arms, supported your relationship with Damien, treated you as one of our own. This is simply the natural next step." The emotional manipulation was so blatant, so different from the subtle techniques they'd used previously, that I understood I'd stumbled into the endgame of their operation. They'd planned this as the moment when I'd be so emotionally invested, so surrounded by family pressure, so caught up in romantic expectations, that I'd sign without proper consideration. I appreciate everything this family has given me, I said carefully, but I won't sign legal documents without proper review, regardless of the emotional context. Damien's facade cracked completely. The loving, grateful partner disappeared, replaced by someone cold and angry in ways that made me realize I'd never actually known him at all. After everything I've shared with you, everything we've built together, you're going to let some paranoid distrust destroy what we have. His voice carried an edge of menace that made my skin crawl. I thought you were stronger than that, Victoria. I thought you understood what partnership really means. The manipulation was now overt, aggressive, designed to make me feel guilty for protecting my own interest. But seeing him drop the act so completely was actually liberating. The man I'd fallen in love with had never existed. This angry, entitled stranger was who Damien really was, and he'd just shown me exactly what I was dealing with. I understand partnership perfectly, I said, moving toward the library door. I also understand manipulation, coercion, and fraud. I'll be leaving now, and I'll have my attorney review these documents before any further discussions. As I walked toward the door, Caroline stepped into my path. Victoria, you're making a terrible mistake. Walking away from this family, from everything Damien offers you, you'll regret this decision. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. I was supposed to understand that refusing to sign would have consequences beyond just ending our relationship. They'd invested too much time and effort in this operation to let me simply walk away with their secrets and my assets intact. But they'd made one crucial error in their psychological assessment. They'd assumed that my desire to belong, my investment in our relationship, my gratitude for their acceptance would override my business instincts and self-preservation. They'd underestimated exactly how I'd built my success in the first place. I'd survived hostile takeovers, predatory competitors, and sophisticated corporate espionage. I'd learned to recognize threats disguised as opportunities, and to respond strategically rather than emotionally when attacked. And now, finally understanding the true nature of what I was facing, I was ready to respond with the full force of 2 decades of business warfare experience. I drove back to London in complete silence, my mind racing through every conversation, every decision, every moment of trust I'd extended over the past 2 years. The prenuptial document sat on my passenger seat like a piece of evidence in a criminal case, which, I was beginning to realize, it essentially was. But instead of falling apart or confronting Damien with emotional accusations, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my early days building my consulting firm, the cold, calculating clarity that came when I was backed into a corner and had to fight for survival. By the time I reached my Belgravia townhouse, I'd made a decision that would have shocked the trusting woman I'd been just hours earlier. I wasn't going to confront anyone. I wasn't going to demand explanations or express hurt feelings. Instead, I was going to do what I did best. I was going to outmaneuver them using the same strategic thinking that had built my business empire. My first call was to Harrison Webb, my private investigator from the secure landline in my home office, rather than my mobile phone, which I now suspected might be compromised. Harrison, I need a comprehensive background investigation, and I need it to be completely confidential. No digital communications, no traceable records, cash payment only. What are we looking into, Victoria? Damien Rothwell, his family, his business associates, and everyone connected to them. I want to know everything: real financial status, criminal background, previous relationships, employment history, everything. And I want to know if there are other women who've been in situations similar to mine. Harrison's experience with corporate espionage meant he understood the gravity of my request without requiring detailed explanation. How deep do you want me to go? All the way to the bottom. I suspect what I'm dealing with is a professional operation, not a simple romance scam. Treat this like a hostile takeover investigation. My second call was to Patricia Sinclair, but not to her main office number. I called her personal mobile, knowing she'd understand that this was an emergency situation requiring absolute discretion. Patricia, I need you to conduct a legal audit of every document I've signed in the past year, with particular attention to anything related to Ashford Rothwell Enterprises. I also need you to freeze all joint accounts and credit facilities immediately. Victoria, what's happened? I've discovered that my business partner and fiancé has been systematically positioning himself to acquire my assets through fraudulent means. I need to understand my legal exposure and protect what I can before he realizes I'm aware of his plan. Patricia had represented me through enough corporate battles to recognize the tone in my voice. I'll start immediately. Do you need personal security arrangements as well? The question hadn't occurred to me, but her professional concern made me realize that people who'd invest 2 years in an elaborate financial fraud might not simply walk away when their plans were discovered. Yes, arrange discreet protection. And Patricia, assume all my regular communication channels are compromised. My third call was the most important one. Theodore Blackmont answered on the second ring, his voice warm with genuine friendship that felt like a lifeline after months of manipulation. Victoria, how lovely to hear from you. How are things with the new business venture? Theodore, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you had any direct communication with Damien Rothwell about business opportunities in the Seychelles? There was a pause that told me everything I needed to know. Victoria, several months ago, a man claiming to represent your interest contacted my office about potential resort partnerships. He had detailed knowledge of your consulting work and your investment portfolio. I assumed he was authorized to make these inquiries on your behalf. My blood turned to ice. What kind of inquiries? Investment opportunities that would require significant capital commitments, secured by your existing asset. I didn't pursue them because the terms seemed unnecessarily favorable to his proposed development company, but I assumed you were aware of his activity. Damien had been using my name and reputation to set up business deals I knew nothing about, probably as another layer of the financial trap they were constructing. Theodore, I authorized no such communications. Damien Rothwell does not represent my interests in any capacity. Good God, Victoria, are you saying you're dealing with some kind of fraud situation? I'm saying I need your help to turn the tables on someone who's been systematically stealing from me for 2 years. The plan that began forming during that conversation was audacious even by my standards, but it had the advantage of using their own strategy against them. If they wanted to manipulate me through romantic expectations and family pressure, I would give them exactly what they thought they wanted while simultaneously destroying them. Over the following week, I maintained normal appearances while secretly building my counterattack. I continued sleeping in the same bed as Damien, sharing meals, discussing business plans, all while documenting every conversation and gathering evidence of his deception. The acting required was emotionally exhausting, but I'd learned from watching him that sometimes survival demanded performance. Harrison's preliminary findings confirmed my worst suspicions. Damien Rothwell's family wealth was largely fictional. The shipping fortune Eleanor spoke about so proudly had been lost decades ago to gambling debts and poor investment. The Gloucestershire estate was mortgaged to the point of near bankruptcy. Caroline's art history background was real, but she'd been financing her lifestyle through association with various wealthy men who'd all experienced mysterious financial difficulties after relationships ended. More disturbing was the pattern Harrison uncovered. I wasn't Damien's first target. Over the past decade, he'd been involved with at least 3 other successful women who'd all suffered significant financial losses during or after their relationships with him. One had lost her pharmaceutical company through a fraudulent partnership agreement. Another had her real estate empire systematically depleted through a series of bad investments he'd recommended. The third had simply disappeared from London society entirely after their relationship ended, her assets apparently liquidated and transferred offshore. This is a professional operation, Harrison reported during our clandestine meeting in a quiet cafe in Hampstead. They target successful independent women who have both substantial assets and emotional vulnerabilities. The family provides credibility and pressure, while multiple associates help coordinate the financial extraction. Patricia's legal audit revealed the true scope of my exposure. The Ashford Rothwell Enterprises documents I'd been so proud of helping draft had been carefully structured to make me liable for debts and obligations I'd never explicitly agreed to undertake. If the business encountered difficulties, which could easily be engineered, I would be personally responsible for millions in losses while Damien's liability was carefully limited. The prenuptial agreement you showed me is the final piece of their puzzle, Patricia explained. Once signed, it would give them legal access to assets not already captured through the business partnership. Combined with the existing contracts, they'd have effective control over your entire financial portfolio. But the most crucial intelligence came from my security team's surveillance of Damien's activities during the week following our estate visit. He was meeting regularly with people I didn't recognize, conducting business I wasn't aware of, and most importantly, he was operating under the assumption that I would eventually cave to family pressure and sign the prenuptial agreement. They thought they had time. They thought I was emotionally compromised and financially naive. They thought my love for Damien and my desire to belong to his family would override my business instincts. They were about to discover exactly how wrong they were. The beautiful part about their strategy was that it required them to maintain the illusion of our romantic relationship until I signed the final documents, which meant I had complete access to their plans, their communications, and their assumptions about my behavior. While they thought they were managing me toward their desired outcome, I was actually gathering everything I needed to destroy them completely. And unlike their operation, which required my cooperation and emotional compliance, my counterattack would require only patience, precision, and the kind of strategic thinking that had made me successful in the first place. The student was about to become the teacher, and the lesson was going to be devastating. The performance I had to maintain over the following 3 weeks was perhaps the most challenging acting job of my life. Every morning, I woke up next to a man I now knew was systematically destroying me, smiled at him over coffee, discussed our future plans, and pretended to be the trusting, love-struck woman he needed me to be. Meanwhile, I was orchestrating the most comprehensive counterattack I'd ever mounted in my business career. The key was making them believe their pressure tactics were working. I began expressing subtle concerns about my attorney's overcautious review of the prenuptial agreement, suggesting that perhaps Patricia was being unnecessarily protective of my interests. During family dinners at Eleanor's estate, I started making comments about feeling torn between legal caution and emotional commitment. I just want to move forward with our life together, I told Caroline during one of our carefully orchestrated lunch meetings. All these legal complications are making something beautiful feel so clinical and cold. Caroline's response was perfectly predictable. Oh, Victoria, you're absolutely right. Love shouldn't be reduced to legal documents and protective clauses. Sometimes you have to trust your heart over your head. But while I was playing the conflicted romantic, my real team was building an elaborate trap. Harrison had expanded his investigation beyond just Damien's operation, to include comprehensive surveillance of all their activity. We'd identified their entire network, not just the family members I knew about, but also the lawyers, accountants, and business associates who helped coordinate their fraud scheme. Patricia was working with international legal experts to trace the offshore accounts where previous victims' assets had been transferred. We'd discovered a sophisticated money laundering operation that extended far beyond simple romance scams into international financial crime. The scope was so extensive that Patricia recommended involving federal authorities once we had sufficient evidence. Theodore had become my secret weapon in ways I hadn't initially anticipated. His resort empire gave him connections throughout the luxury travel industry, including private aviation, exclusive hotels, and high-end financial services. More importantly, his reputation for absolute discretion meant he could make inquiries and arrangements without raising suspicions in circles where Damien was known. I've spoken with colleagues in the Seychelles, Theodore reported during one of our encrypted video calls. Damien has been using your name to secure commitments for a resort development project that doesn't actually exist. He's collected substantial deposits from investors who believe you're the primary financial backing for the venture. The revelation was staggering. Not only was Damien stealing from me directly, but he was also using my reputation to defraud other investors in schemes I knew nothing about. The potential legal liability was enormous, but it also provided leverage I could use against him. My security team, led by a former Scotland Yard detective named Marcus Pemberton, had been conducting round-the-clock surveillance of Damien's activity. What they discovered was a level of operational sophistication that explained how he'd maintained multiple simultaneous schemes without detection. He's operating 3 separate fraud operations currently, Marcus reported. You're the primary target, but there are two other women being cultivated for future extraction, one in Manchester, one in Edinburgh, both successful business owners, both recently divorced, both following the same psychological profile they've identified as optimal target. The Manchester woman was a pharmaceutical executive named Dr. Sarah Whitman who'd recently inherited substantial family wealth. The Edinburgh target was Margaret Sinclair, who owned a chain of boutique hotels throughout Scotland. Both were being courted by associates of Damien's operation, using variations of the same emotional manipulation techniques I'd experienced. "We need to warn them," I told Marcus, but he shook his head. "If we intervene now, we risk alerting the entire network that they're under investigation. Better to gather enough evidence to shut down the whole operation, and protect all current and future victims simultaneously." The most crucial element of my performance was convincing Damien that I was gradually weakening under family pressure. I began scheduling additional meetings with Eleanor, during which I'd express growing frustration with my attorney's thoroughness. I started making comments about feeling isolated from the family I'd grown to love because of legal technicality. "Maybe Patricia is being overly protective," I suggested during dinner at the estate. "After all, we're family now. Surely I can trust family more than I trust lawyers." Eleanor's satisfaction was visible as she squeezed my hand across the table. "Exactly right, dear. Lawyers profit from creating complications where none need exist. Family bonds are built on trust, not contracts." But the most delicate part of my deception involved managing Damien's growing impatience. The Seychelles trip was approaching, and I could sense his anxiety about finalizing the prenuptial agreement before we traveled. He'd begun making subtle threats disguised as concerns about our relationship timeline. "I'm starting to worry that your hesitation about the prenup reflects deeper trust issues between us," he said one evening, as we walked through Hyde Park. "If you can't commit to legal formalities, how can I be sure you're truly committed to our future together?" The manipulation was becoming more aggressive, more desperate, which told me their timeline was probably driven by external pressures I wasn't aware of. Harrison's investigation had revealed that the Rothwell family's financial situation was even more precarious than initially discovered. They owed substantial money to some very dangerous people, and my assets represented their only viable escape from mounting debts. "Perhaps you're right," I replied, allowing uncertainty to creep into my voice. "Maybe I am overthinking this. Love should be about trust, not legal protection." His relief was palpable, and that evening he was more affectionate than he'd been in weeks. But lying in his arms, feeling him relax because he thought he'd successfully manipulated me into compliance, I felt nothing but cold determination to see him destroyed. The Seychelles trip was scheduled for the following week, and I knew that would be when they planned to execute the final phase of their operation. The romantic setting, the family pressure, the isolation from my normal support systems — it was designed to be the perfect environment for forcing my signature on documents that would transfer everything I'd worked for into their control. What they didn't know was that I'd already arranged for my own private jet to follow theirs to the same destination. While they thought I'd be stranded and vulnerable in paradise, I'd actually be arriving with my own team of legal experts, financial investigators, and security professionals. The Seychelles was about to become the setting for the most comprehensive takedown of a criminal operation I'd ever orchestrated. And the beautiful irony was that they'd chosen the location themselves, thinking it would give them every advantage. Instead, it was going to be where their entire world collapsed around them. But first, I had to get through one more week of pretending to be the trusting victim they needed me to be. One more week of sleeping next to someone who'd spent 2 years systematically destroying my life. One more week of family dinners where I smiled and nodded while they planned my financial ruin. The hardest part wasn't the acting, it was containing my anticipation for what was going to happen when they finally realized they'd underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. The morning of our departure to the Seychelles, Damien was practically vibrating with nervous energy. He'd been awake before dawn, making hushed phone calls from his office and triple-checking documents I wasn't supposed to know about. When I emerged from the bedroom, he greeted me with the kind of forced enthusiasm that barely masked his underlying tension. "Ready for paradise, darling?" he asked, pulling me into an embrace that felt more possessive than affectionate. This is going to be the most important trip of our lives. He had no idea how accurate that statement would prove to be. The ride to Heathrow was filled with his elaborate descriptions of the Four Seasons resort, the romantic dinners he'd planned, the special moments we'd share on pristine beaches. But I could see him checking his phone constantly, exchanging messages with people whose names I recognized from Harrison's investigation. The final coordination of their operation was happening in real time, right beside me in the back of our hired car. Natalie's meeting us at the airport with the final documents, he mentioned casually as we approached Terminal 5. Just some last-minute business paperwork that needs signing before we can fully relax. The prenuptial agreement, no doubt, along with whatever additional contracts they'd prepared to complete my financial destruction. I nodded and smiled, playing the excited girlfriend while mentally reviewing the signals I'd arranged with my own team. At the airport, the performance reached its crescendo. Damien guided me through check-in with exaggerated solicitude, ensuring I felt pampered and special while Natalie hovered nearby with her briefcase full of documents. Caroline and Eleanor had come to see us off, creating a family send-off that was designed to reinforce the emotional pressure I'd be under once we reached our destination. "Have a wonderful time, darling," Eleanor said, kissing my cheek with what anyone observing would interpret as genuine maternal affection. "I know this trip will be absolutely life-changing for both of you." Caroline hugged me tightly and whispered, "I'm so excited for what's coming next. You're going to love being an official member of this family." Their confidence was absolute. They believed they'd successfully managed me to this point, that the romantic setting and continued family pressure would guarantee my compliance with whatever they presented me in the Seychelles. They thought they'd identified all my psychological triggers and exploited them perfectly. But as we approached the gate for our flight, Damien made the mistake that would reveal the true nature of our relationship to anyone paying attention. "Victoria," he said, his voice taking on an edge I'd learned to recognize, "I've realized we should handle the boarding separately. You know how these luxury flights can be. Sometimes it's easier if I manage the logistics while you relax." He handed me what looked like a boarding pass, but I could see immediately that something was wrong with it. The seat number was different from what I'd booked. The class of service didn't match our reservations, and when I looked more closely I realized it wasn't for our flight at all. "This isn't right," I said, confused despite understanding exactly what was happening. "This shows a completely different flight number." "Oh, that's just an administrative error," Natalie interjected smoothly, appearing at my elbow with practiced efficiency. "I'll get it sorted out while Damien handles the initial boarding process. These things happen with last-minute booking changes." But Damien was already walking toward the gate with his own boarding pass, genuine confidence in his stride, not even looking back to ensure I was following. Caroline and Eleanor had positioned themselves to continue engaging me in conversation, ostensibly to help pass time while the booking error was resolved. "Don't worry about the paperwork, dear," Eleanor said, linking her arm through mine. "Damien handles all the travel details so well. Just relax and enjoy being taken care of." That's when I understood their final strategy. They weren't planning to resolve any booking error. They were planning to leave me at the gate while Damien boarded the flight alone, probably with Natalie, heading to the Seychelles to execute whatever scheme they'd prepared using my name and credentials. I would be abandoned at Heathrow, confused and humiliated, while they put the finishing touches on my financial destruction from a tropical paradise. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. After 2 years of building my emotional dependence on him, after making me believe I'd found the family I'd always wanted, after positioning himself as the love of my life, Damien was planning to abandon me at the airport gate like discarded luggage. But the beautiful irony was that while they thought they were executing their masterstroke, they were actually walking directly into the trap I'd been preparing for weeks. As I watched Damien disappear down the jet bridge without a backward glance, I pulled out my phone and sent a single text message: "Eagle has landed. Initiate Protocol 7. Within minutes, my own team was in motion. Harrison Webb, who'd been maintaining surveillance from the airport's business lounge, began following Damien's flight path to coordinate with authorities in the Seychelles. Patricia Sinclair, working with international legal experts, initiated the asset freezing procedures we'd prepared. Marcus Pemberton activated the security protocols that would protect the other women Damien's operation was targeting, but most importantly, Theodore Blackmont's private jet was already fueled and ready at the private aviation terminal. While Damien thought he was flying to paradise to execute his final scheme, I was about to arrive there with a full legal team, complete evidence of his criminal operation, and the cooperation of local authorities who'd been briefed on the situation. "Man," asked James Morrison, Theodore's chief pilot, as I settled into the luxurious cabin of the Gulfstream G650. "We're cleared for immediate departure to Mahé. Mr. Blackmont has confirmed that everything is arranged on the ground." As we taxied toward takeoff, I looked out the window at Terminal 5, where Eleanor and Caroline were probably still maintaining their vigil, believing their performance had been flawless. They thought I was devastated and confused, probably crying in some airport bathroom while trying to understand how my perfect boyfriend had abandoned me. Instead, I was reviewing the comprehensive legal documentation that would destroy their entire operation within hours of my arrival in the Seychelles. Bank account seizures, criminal charges, asset recovery procedures, and most satisfying of all, evidence that would expose every detail of their elaborate fraud to the victims of their previous scheme. But the most crucial element of my counterattack wasn't legal or financial. It was psychological. Damien expected to arrive in paradise believing he'd successfully manipulated and abandoned me. He expected to spend his first evening in the Seychelles celebrating his victory and planning how to liquidate my asset. Instead, he was going to discover that the woman he thought he'd destroyed was already waiting for him, along with law enforcement officials who'd been thoroughly briefed on his criminal activity. The student was about to become the teacher, and the lesson was going to take place in the exact location he'd chosen for his moment of triumph. As our jet climbed through the clouds toward the Seychelles, I couldn't help but smile at the poetic justice of it all. Damien had thought he was leaving me stranded and helpless at a gate in Heathrow, but he'd actually just given me the perfect opportunity to fly directly into position for his complete destruction. The Seychelles sunrise was spectacular from the terrace of Theodore's private villa, but I barely noticed the beauty as I reviewed the final details of what would be the most comprehensive takedown I'd ever orchestrated. My legal team had worked through the night, coordinating with local authorities, international banking regulators, and law enforcement agencies in 3 countries. By the time Damien's flight touched down at Seychelles International Airport, every element of his criminal operation would be frozen, exposed, and ready for prosecution. Detective Inspector Williams of the Seychelles Financial Crimes Unit had been briefed extensively on the case. "Ms. Ashford, the scope of this operation is extraordinary. We've identified shell companies in 5 different jurisdictions, all connected to Mr. Rothwell's network. The evidence you've provided has allowed us to coordinate simultaneous actions across multiple countries." Through the villa's floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the Four Seasons resort where Damien expected to spend the week, celebrating his victory and planning my financial destruction. Instead, he was about to walk into the most sophisticated trap I'd ever constructed. Harrison's surveillance team confirmed that Damien and Natalie had landed on schedule, completely unaware that their every movement was being monitored. "They've checked into the presidential suite, under your name," Harrison reported via encrypted satellite phone. "Damien's using your credit cards, your reservations, everything exactly as planned. He's operating under the complete assumption that you're stranded and devastated in London." The psychological element of my revenge was crucial. I didn't want Damien to simply face legal consequences. I wanted him to experience the same sense of betrayal and abandonment he'd inflicted on me and his previous victims. I wanted him to understand what it felt like to have someone you trusted completely turn out to be your worst enemy. Patricia's legal team had been working with international prosecutors to ensure that when we moved, the action would be swift and comprehensive. "We've traced the offshore accounts where assets from previous victims were transferred," she reported from her temporary command center in the villa's secondary building. "The Edinburgh hotel owner, the Manchester pharmaceutical executive, the London real estate developer, we can recover assets for all of them, but the most satisfying element was how thoroughly we'd turned his own strategy against him. Just as he'd used my reputation to defraud other investors, we'd used his assumptions about my emotional vulnerability to position ourselves perfectly for his destruction." At precisely 11 a.m., as Damien was probably enjoying his first champagne breakfast at the resort, Detective Inspector Williams led a coordinated raid on the presidential suite. The timing was deliberate. late enough for him to feel completely secure, early enough to catch him before he could begin executing whatever final phases of his plan he'd brought to the Seychelles. I watched through high-powered binoculars as the scene unfolded at the resort. Damien emerged from the suite in handcuffs, his face a picture of confusion and growing panic. Natalie was arrested separately, along with 2 other associates who'd apparently flown in to assist with their operation. The beautiful irony was that their own thorough planning had made them easy to track and arrest, but I wasn't content to observe from a distance. As the authorities secured the crime scene, I made my own appearance at the Four Seasons, walking into the lobby where Damien was being processed for transport to the police station. The moment he saw me, the color drained from his face completely. For several seconds he seemed unable to process what he was seeing. In his mind, I should have been thousands of miles away, crying and confused, probably still trying to understand how he'd disappeared from my life without explanation. "Hello, Damien," I said calmly, approaching where he sat in handcuffs under guard. "I thought I'd join you for our romantic getaway after all." His expression cycled through disbelief, confusion, and finally a dawning understanding of how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. "That's impossible," he whispered. "You were stranded at Heathrow. The boarding pass, the flight, everything was arranged." "Oh, I received your boarding pass," I replied, pulling the fake document from my purse. "Along with screenshots of every phone conversation you've had for the past month, recordings of your family's attempts to pressure me into signing fraudulent contracts, and complete documentation of your previous victims' experiences with your operation." Detective Inspector Williams stepped forward with a thick folder of evidence. "Mr. Rothwell, you're being charged with international fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. The evidence against you has been building for weeks, with full cooperation from Ms. Ashford." I could see Damien's mind racing, trying to understand how his perfect plan had been so thoroughly demolished. "But the family, the pressure, you were breaking down, agreeing to everything." "I was gathering evidence," I said simply. "Every family dinner where Eleanor manipulated me, every conversation where Caroline extracted financial information, every document you pressured me to sign, it was all being recorded and documented." "You taught me something valuable about performance, Damien. You're just not as good at it as you thought." The other arrests were happening simultaneously. Harrison's team had coordinated with authorities in London to arrest Eleanor, Caroline, and Michael Hartington. The entire network was being dismantled in real time, with evidence so comprehensive that prosecution would be straightforward. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Detective Williams handed me a document authorizing the immediate freezing of all accounts connected to their operation. "Ms. Ashford, we've recovered approximately 4.2 million that was stolen from you and other victims. The funds will be returned once the legal proceedings are complete." As they led Damien away, he looked back at me one final time. "I loved you," he said, as if that somehow justified 2 years of systematic deception and theft. "No," I replied quietly. "You loved what I could provide. You loved my assets, my reputation, my willingness to trust. You never loved me, Damien. You don't even know who I am." Later that evening, as I sat on Theodore's terrace watching the sunset over the Indian Ocean, I reflected on everything that had led to this moment. The past 2 years had been a masterclass in manipulation and betrayal, but they'd also taught me something crucial about my own strength and capabilities. I'd built my business success by being strategic, thorough, and unemotional when necessary. When Damien attacked my personal life, I'd simply applied the same principles to destroy him completely. The difference was that while his operation required my compliance and emotional vulnerability, my counterattack had required only patience, precision, and the resources I'd built over 20 years of legitimate success. The next morning's headlines would tell the story of an international fraud ring that had been dismantled through the courage of one victim who'd refused to remain a victim. Other women who'd suffered similar experiences would see that justice was possible, that elaborate manipulations could be overcome through strategic thinking and proper resources. Sarah Whitman and Margaret Sinclair, the Manchester and Edinburgh targets, had been protected from becoming victims. The offshore accounts had been traced and frozen, preventing future thefts from other unsuspecting women. But most importantly, I'd learned that strength isn't about avoiding betrayal, it's about how you respond when betrayal is discovered. Damien had given me the greatest gift of all by showing me exactly who he was. and in doing so he'd freed me to show him exactly who Victoria Ashford was when she stopped being nice and started being strategic. The Seychelles had indeed been life-changing, just not in the way anyone had originally planned. 6 months later, I stood in the renovated boardroom of Ashford Consulting, looking out at a view of London that seemed somehow clearer than it had before. The company had not only survived the chaos of Damien's attempted destruction, but had emerged stronger, more focused, and more successful than ever. The publicity surrounding the international fraud case had ironically enhanced my reputation as someone who could handle complex, high-stakes situations with precision and intelligence. "The Edinburgh client is requesting an extension of our contract," Rebecca announced, entering with a stack of proposals that represented more business than I'd seen in years. "Apparently, Margaret Sinclair has been recommending our services throughout Scotland. She says you saved her from making the biggest mistake of her life." Margaret Sinclair, the woman who would have been Damien's next victim if we hadn't intervened. She'd contacted me personally after the arrests, tearfully explaining how close she'd come to transferring substantial assets to a man who'd seemed like her perfect match. Our correspondence had evolved into a genuine friendship, one built on mutual respect rather than manipulation. "Whitman's pharmaceutical company wants to discuss a merger strategy consultation as well," Rebecca continued. "She specifically requested you personally, said she trusts your judgment more than any consultant she's worked with." Sarah Whitman had sent a handwritten note after the trial, expressing gratitude that felt entirely different from the manufactured appreciation I'd received from Damien's family. "You didn't just save my money," she'd written. "You saved my faith in my own judgment. Thank you for showing me that being successful doesn't mean I have to be vulnerable." The trial had been a media sensation, but not in the sensationalized way I'd feared. Instead, it had sparked important conversations about sophisticated financial fraud, the targeting of successful women, and the psychological manipulation techniques used by professional criminals. I'd testified for 3 days, laying out the systematic nature of their operation with the same precision I used in business presentations. Damien had received 12 years in prison, along with Eleanor, Caroline, and their entire network. Michael Hartington had been disbarred and faced additional charges for legal malpractice. The sentences were severe enough to send a clear message to other potential fraudsters while providing justice for all the victims who'd suffered at their hands. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome wasn't the criminal justice, it was the civil recovery. Every penny stolen from previous victims had been returned, along with interest and compensation for the emotional damage they'd endured. The offshore accounts, once thought untraceable, had been completely dismantled through international cooperation I'd helped coordinate. "There's someone here to see you," Rebecca said, her voice carrying a note of curiosity. "A Mr. Harrison Webb. He says it's regarding the Whitmore investigation." Harrison appeared in my doorway with the same professional demeanor he'd maintained throughout our previous work together, but there was something different in his expression. Over the months since the Seychelles operation, he'd become more than just a hired investigator. He'd become someone I trusted completely, someone who'd seen me at my most vulnerable and most powerful. "Victoria, we've identified another operation," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Similar structure, different family, targeting tech entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. The pattern is almost identical to what Damien's group was doing, but the scale is large." I felt that familiar surge of cold clarity that had served me so well during my own ordeal. "How many victims?" "Currently active, 4 that we've identified, but based on the financial structures they're using, they've been operating for at least 5 years. The total theft is estimated at over $50 million. The scope was staggering but not surprising. The success of operations like Damien's would inevitably inspire copycat schemes. The question was whether anything could be done to stop them before more successful, trusting people lost everything they'd worked to build. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" I asked, already mentally calculating the resources we'd need for an investigation of that magnitude. "The tech community is tight-knit, but also competitive. If we can identify the key players and build trust with current targets, we could potentially coordinate with federal authorities within 6 months." I looked out at the London skyline, thinking about Whitman, Margaret Sinclair, and all the other women who'd contacted me since the trial. Women who'd shared stories of relationships that had felt too good to be true, financial requests that had seemed reasonable at the time, family pressure that had overridden their professional instincts. Harrison, how would you feel about expanding your practice, focusing specifically on this type of sophisticated fraud investigation? His smile was immediate and genuine. I was hoping you'd ask that. I've been researching similar cases internationally, and the problem is much larger than we initially realized. There are networks operating in at least 12 countries that we know of. The idea that had been forming in my mind since the trial suddenly crystallized into a concrete vision. What if we created something new, not just reactive investigations, but proactive protection for potential targets, education, early warning systems, rapid response capability, a consulting firm that specializes in preventing and dismantling romance fraud operations? Harrison said, understanding immediately where my thoughts were leading. Using your business expertise and my investigation experience to stay ahead of the criminals instead of just responding to them. Over the following weeks, the concept evolved into something that felt like destiny rather than simply business opportunity. The Ashford Web Protection Initiative would combine sophisticated financial analysis, psychological profiling, international investigation capabilities, and most importantly, education programs that could help potential victims recognize manipulation before it destroyed their lives. Theodore had been our first major investor, contributing both funding and his international network of contacts. Victoria, what you survived could help protect thousands of people, he'd said during our initial planning meeting. This isn't just business. This is justice prevention rather than justice reaction. The morning I signed the incorporation papers for our new venture, I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years earlier. Successful but lonely, confident in business but naive about personal relationships. Strong enough to build an empire but vulnerable enough to nearly lose it all to someone who'd studied exactly how to exploit that vulnerability. That woman would have been horrified by the idea of publicly discussing her private humiliation. She would have wanted to quietly rebuild and pretend the nightmare had never happened. She would have seen survival as victory enough. But the woman I'd become understood something more profound about strength and purpose. True victory wasn't just surviving betrayal. It was transforming that experience into something that could protect others from experiencing the same devastation. Damien had thought he was teaching me about manipulation and exploitation. Instead, he'd taught me about resilience, strategic thinking, and the power that comes from refusing to be anyone's victim. The best revenge, I'd learned, wasn't destroying your enemy. It was becoming so much stronger than they'd ever imagined possible that their attempts to hurt you became the foundation for something beautiful and powerful they could never touch. As I looked out at London from my office window, I realized I was genuinely grateful for everything Damien had put me through. Not because I'd enjoyed the experience, but because it had revealed capabilities and strength I might never have discovered otherwise. He'd tried to steal my future. Instead, he'd given me a purpose that was larger and more meaningful than anything I'd imagined before I met him. And that, I thought with a smile, was the most perfect justice of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.